cases in the hospital are a lagging indicator of reality. And when you don't have accurate testing on the ground, which we don't, then all you really have to go on is cases. And that leaves you blind for a few weeks as to the reality of what's happening.
Hey everybody, I hope you enjoyed this episode brought to you by our sponsors at Whoop. You can save 15% off your purchase when you go to whoop.com and use the code HT at checkout. Now enjoy the episode.
Hey everybody, welcome to Health Theory. Today's guest is Dr. Rishi Desai. He's a pediatric infectious disease doctor who was also formerly a member of the CDC, working in their viral disease division doing outbreak research. Additionally, he's a chief medical officer at Osmosis and has been a leading voice across pretty much all media types, educating the public daily on the current state of COVID-19. Dr. Desai, welcome to Health Theory.
Thanks a lot for having me. You can call me Rishi by my first name.
Amazing, man. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to get into the current state of this. Give us the most up-to-date learnings, and the things that I care most about are obviously what is actually happening inside the body at the viral level. Is that obviously everything that we do to protect ourselves, the solutions to this are all going to be predicated on us pinning that down.
Yeah, so let's get into that. The virus enters your body. Typically, you're going to get it in through one of three passageways: your eyes, nose, and mouth, probably mostly your nose and mouth. And once it hits the back of your throat, that's where it starts its journey. It starts infecting cells and gets down into your lungs. And that's been the story for most of this outbreak. We've thought about it as a lung disease and talked about it as infecting, the little alveoli and causing damage to the lungs. And I think what we're learning now, you asked me about kind of what's the bleeding edge. I'll tell you, it's the blood. And so as you go across from the lungs into the blood vessels, it's what's happening in the blood vessels. And I think that's what we're starting to realize right now. In the past few weeks, we've seen more and more studies talking about strokes in young folks. And so someone your age shouldn't be getting a stroke. You're a healthy person, presumably. And now we're seeing strokes in people your age, my age for sure. And that's worrisome. People have thought up until now it's a disease of old people and it's a disease of lungs. And now you tell them, well, there's an actual increased stroke risk, and that's because it causes endovascular damage. It's literally infecting the cells that line the blood vessels and damaging them. And what does that sound like? Well, that sounds like what sets up for a heart attack or a stroke. And that's, I think, the increasing realization that people are having about SARS-CoV-2, or the virus that causes COVID-19.
Yeah, the notion of what's going on in the blood to me is really interesting. It certainly points at things that we can do to ultimately defeat, if I can use that word, the virus. But talk to me a little bit more about what's happening at a cellular level. So the cool thing is I've really started to understand how viruses work. To be honest, in the beginning, I always imagined a cold virus being able to move, that it had some sort of locomotion. So beginning to understand that's not how it travels, that it has the spikes on the outside, that it is basically has evolved to attack only a few type of cells for the sort of infection site, which is why it goes for things that have a mucosal layer, so your eyes, your nose, your throat, and that it has to get on that. But once it gets on that the infection, from what I'm told, happens very quickly, within seconds. But getting into what's really going on in those cells that are lining the blood vessels, what's actually happening? What is the damage that it's doing?
So the first thing I'll say is that think of it as a numbers game, right? So you just mentioned a really classic example. You think of it touching you and it getting in and it taking 5 seconds to do so. That's not how I think of it. I think of it as if there's a lot of it, then yeah, I'm in trouble. If there's a little bit, I'm not in trouble. So there are a number of innate immune defense systems you have in place. And, it's a little bit like, think of another numbers game, sperm creating fertilization. There are a number of reasons why a sperm wouldn't make it to an egg. And it's only because we, have millions and billions of them that you get one to survive. It's a numbers game. Similarly, the virus is trying to play a numbers game. It's going to get stuck by mucus. We have little proteins, defensins within that mucus that are going to deactivate or attach to the virus. We have mucosal antibodies. We have local monocytes. You have all sorts of things set up to allow for you to not get an infection. And if you get overwhelmed, if you get too much virus, then yeah, maybe you'll get an infection. Maybe some cells will get hijacked. Even when they get hijacked, there is a numbers game on the other side. Getting one cell infected, technically you might think of that as an infection, and maybe some would agree with you. Others would say, well, an infection is when you can detect it. Well, what's the detectable threshold? Is it a single cell? Can we detect a single cell infected? Not really, not that I've ever seen. So you have to have enough of an infection to even detect infection to call it infection. And again, that's a numbers game too. And the reason this matters is take two scenarios. I'm in a grocery store, I grab an apple, someone sneezed on it 2 days ago. There was a tiny amount of virus on it 2 days ago. That's been steadily decreasing as the ambient temperature and humidity in the grocery store is causing the virus to essentially die off. And so the actual threat is pretty low. It's a very, very tiny amount of virus on that apple. But comparing now that scenario to another scenario where you're a healthcare worker, you've intubated a patient, they coughed in your face, they got a lot of inoculum. Then you move to patient 2, they coughed in your face. Patient 3, they didn't cough, but they sneezed 10 minutes before you walked in. You're getting multiple large inoculums of virus. When you go home that night, you're dealing with a lot more than that person with the apple. So these are two different scenarios, and so numbers matter. And that's why we're seeing so many more healthcare workers that are in that setting get sick when they're healthy and otherwise kind of able-bodied, when in other scenarios you don't see those same attack rates. So that's the first point I want to make. Now the second point is what happens when a cell gets infected. You correctly point out cells, viruses don't walk around. In fact, that's why isolation works. They don't cross highways or walk across the street. They don't walk around your body either. And so when a cell is infected, that cell might lyse, it might break, and the stuff inside might come out. Where does it go? It goes to the immediate vicinity, right? It goes right into that area. Now, there is some aerosolization and things like that we know, and you make bioaerosols even when you speak. And so it does actually make its way out into the environment through that mechanism. But it itself is not moving. It's hitching a ride on a little droplet of mucus, and that's its ride. That's its Uber to get into your workspace.
Yeah, the idea of viral load I find really interesting in terms of trying to protect yourself. So obviously being outside, if you have to come into contact with somebody for whatever reason, being outside is going to be obviously much better. And then also my understanding is that you have like a band of humidity which is problematic for the virus. So if it's too low, the virus thrives. If it's too high, I've heard that it thrives. But somewhere in like the 40 to 50% range, am I getting that roughly right, that it struggles?
Yeah, a lot of the humidity studies and data we have are actually not even on SARS-CoV-2. We have some, but a lot of it is based on other cousin viruses like MERS and SARS from back in 2002. So we're extrapolating and saying, hey, this is another coronavirus. I'm sure it behaves similarly. And so when we look at temperature, humidity data, much of it is from other viruses in the same coronavirus family. You're right. There are two silver linings around this virus. One, it's not that hardy. So it's in this fat bubble, and it's got a little RNA in it. And that fat bubble, essentially, you get a bit of a cocoon when you have a bit of, I call it spittle, but essentially the little bits of stuff that come out of my nose and mouth every time I spit that I can't even see. Technically, they're called bioaerosols. Those land somewhere. Sometimes they float in the air. And when they land or they're floating, they're evaporating, right? So at every moment, they're slowly evaporating. And that surface to volume ratio is making it more and more likely to evaporate over time. And remember, that's the ride it's hitching. So the more it evaporates, the more it's kind of becoming smaller and smaller. And therefore, it's less prone to just falling on the ground. And so then it really just diffuses in the air.
So let's talk about this as an outbreak. So you were working at the CDC looking at literally what we're living through now. One, give me some context. Where do you see this going? What kind of drop-off should we expect? I've seen that some of the numbers are beginning to trail off in the US. Are we on the decline now? Are we not? And then the thing I care most about is this coming back in the fall?
Right. So let's go through those in order. I think things are getting better in most parts of the country. I think things are getting worse in some parts of the country. I think things were getting better and might get worse in some areas. Let me give you a concrete example. Southern California. Things were doing pretty well. And then everyone hit the beach this past weekend. So much so that Governor Newsom just said, we're closing the Orange County beaches. Now, what we're possibly going to see in 10 days is all those people that were beachgoers are going to go home. they're going to have more disease overall than they did previously. They're going to spend time with their elderly parents, their elderly in-laws. Those folks are going to get sick. Maybe that'll be 8 days from now. And then those folks are going to get really sick, sick enough to go to the ER 18 to 21 days from now. So maybe in 3 weeks, we'll see a little uptick. And we'll all scratch our heads and think, what is this? What happened? It's from that beach incident 3 weeks ago, guys. That's why you're seeing this now. So we're going to see blips. And this is the challenge, is that the cases that come into the hospital are a lagging indicator of what's actually happening. An example is when you look out at the starry sky, you see light on your iris, right? But that star may be gone. You know, it takes billions of years for that light to hit you. So you're getting a lagging indicator of the reality of your solar system and outer space. Cases in the hospital are a lagging indicator of reality. And when you don't have accurate testing on the ground, which we don't, then all you really have to go on is cases. And that leaves you blind for a few weeks as to the reality of what's happening. So that's my sense on what our country is experiencing. Now, all of the models are based on continued social distancing. That's falling apart right now. State by state, we're seeing people lift barriers and saying, hey, it's okay to do, you know, let's say outdoors activities are okay. Golf courses are open now because they're outdoors. You know, yard work's okay. Landscaping, that industry is okay. Construction's okay. As you start opening up industries, you're going to start seeing more and more chance of this sort of uptick. Now, my hope is that we'll see a little uptick, which I imagine we'll probably see, maybe regionally, maybe even nationally. But that what happens afterwards is the key. Are we going to close down again? Or are we going to say, well, let's let it ride? Because when you let it ride for 3 more weeks. Now you've got 6 weeks, because it took 3 weeks to get that data. And then you didn't do anything about it. So now you got a few more weeks to let it ride. And so we'll see what happens. But whatever we do is really, it's a delayed effect. And so if we see a surge, it's because we don't have actual on-the-ground reconnaissance. We're going by this really old, 3-week-old data. And we keep making mistakes and fumbling our way through. So that's my challenge, or that's the challenge that I see. Are we going to see an uptick in fall? There's a good chance. Because I think what will happen is we're going to keep making these little fumbles along the way. We're like, open, no close, open, no close. And we're not actually closing it down for a significant period of time to really shut it down. And at the same time, we're just now getting contact tracing up and going. We're just now getting testing to the levels where we need it to be. Meaning, our average number of tests per day in the US, I don't know if you've seen it, but it's about 200,000. Where was it the first week of April? 150. So, gosh, in the whole month of April, we bumped it from 150 to 200. We need to get to 800. That's the goal. What are we doing? We're slow walking to the solution. We're not running to a solution.
Now, what I want to know is I don't even think about colds and flus, say, May through September, right? I don't even think about it. The odds, like, I wash my hands like a psychopath from October through April normally, just because I hate getting sick so much, I can't even tell you. But, like, I'm already a psycho. And as a psycho, I always let my guard down in the summer months. So why is this one so virulent that we still have to be on guard even now as we approach May? Like, it is hot as hell here in SoCal right now. I'm just shocked that this one sort of defies the normal pattern.
Yeah, so I'll take a word you just said, virulent, and hone in on it. So there's contagiousness and there's virulence. So there are some things that are super virulent, let's say Ebola, but not that contagious. What you're worried about is contagiousness. Why is it that people are getting it so much, even in the summer months? And what I think the answer is going to be is that there's just so much disease out there, and it's pretty darn good at getting across. So that could be, one, because the viral load you generate is huge. So maybe it's replicating like mad. And so when you do cough, it's not just a little bit, like 10 to the 6, maybe it's 10 to the 7. Like, who knows what the exact inoculum is that you're putting out there. It could be effective at actually living in the environment. Maybe it's just a little bit more hardy than I'm giving it credit for, or maybe it lands on larger bioaerosols, so it has a little bit more time before they dry up completely. It could be that it's actually really darn good, and this is actually where I'm putting my bet, at getting attached to that ACE2 receptor in the cell. That's the name of the receptor, and we have ACE2 receptors on different cells in our body. Maybe it doesn't need too many of those receptors to get an infection to go across. Maybe other viruses need many more kind of hits to hit that receptor and tag it. This one just sticks like a lock and a key. Just really, really nice fit. And so it could be a number of those factors. Whatever it is, I think you're right that in the summer months, it's getting warmer and warmer. We're still seeing it. We saw outbreaks in Singapore. Singapore is, along that tropical belt. In many countries along that tropical belt, it's exploding in India right now. So we're seeing it in places where it is fairly humid, fairly hot, and it's still kind of causing a lot of disease. I think resting on this idea that it's going to just dry up in the environment or that the humidity will kind of get it is probably not realistic. I think what's much more realistic is thinking about it from a person-to-person standpoint rather than an environmental fomite to a person standpoint. Some of that's probably happening, but it's probably much more just person-to-person.
So as you think about like protecting yourself and your family, like the more that we understand what the virus is doing, in fact, I'd love to hear more about the ACE2 receptor, how that works, and how that influences how you think about keeping yourself safe.
Sure. A couple of concrete things that I do. So I try, and I'm not perfect at this, and I don't expect anyone to be, but I try to batch my grocery shopping. I try to batch my errands and say, let me do one errand and hit up a few different spots. And so I don't have to keep going back out again. Every time I leave the house, that's a chance, especially if I'm going to an enclosed space where there's not as much ventilation. When you're outdoors, I'm going to the park, that's a different ball of wax than if I'm going to a store where the ventilation, even though they of course have HVAC systems, they're not ventilating nearly as well and effectively as an outdoors area with a breeze. So it's all about dilution. If you can dilute the virus, whether you do that with water when you're washing your apple, whether you're doing that with air as you're going through an outdoor space, whether you're rolling the windows down in an Uber, if you're in an Uber, anything you're doing to dilute is stacking the deck in your favor. So that's the first thing. Minimizing trips to high-risk locations. High risk is anything that's enclosed. So again, like minimizing and batching your trips. That's the second thing. The third thing is when you're in your home, cohorting yourself to your home. So it's just me, my wife, my son, my dog, right? Like that's our cohort. We stay together and we don't, our son isn't going off anywhere else. We're staying as a unit. And so that's the best you can do is kind of keep your unit safe. If you guys get sick, likely it's everyone in the house that's going to get sick. So protect everyone and make sure everyone's making the same smart choices you're making. Masks and coverings. There's a lot of data now on the fact that they're probably helpful and probably need to be mandated, frankly, especially in indoor settings. So that's another thing that people can do is just cover their mouth. It protects the source, so you're not spitting it out. Even if you're talking, as I said, you can get it out there, but also protects you from inhaling it. And there are masks that you can make at home that have pretty good effectiveness at getting viruses screened out, believe it or not. So we can talk about that as well. And the one, I'll just give you the answer there, is polyester. Seems pretty effective with kitchen towels inside. So that's a good strategy. So those are some concrete steps you can take to minimize your chances of getting sick.
So talk to me more about the ACE2 receptor. So what's going on there? Why is your money on that?
Yeah, so when you look at the ACE2 receptor, it's a receptor that sits on the airways, and we know that that's where the spike protein, you alluded to it, it's called coronavirus because it looks like it has a crown under a microscope, and corona means crown. So it looks like it's wearing a little crown. Well, that crown is studded with little proteins. Those proteins that are studded in its crown are spike proteins. So those are the proteins it's using to attach. What does it attach to? It attaches to a receptor. We call it the ACE2 receptor. That receptor, it's lining many cells. It's lining the cells of the airways, but also it's loaded in the blood vessel cells. So those cells have a lot of ACE2. And as we're seeing more and more disease in the blood vessels, one hypothesis is that that's how it's causing the disease. We know it binds to ACE2 already. Those cells have it. Logical conclusion is probably what's happening. And so my money is on that's where it's binding, and that's why it causes a lot of disease. Now, there are some ideas. Like, what if you, for example, inject someone with soluble ACE2, where it's kind of free floating? That ACE2 could bind up the spike protein. And therefore, the spike protein can't bind to your ACE2 because it's already bound to this soluble ACE2. So there are ideas out there, and these are more than just ideas. These are actually, some of these are in randomized controlled trials where they're trying to see if this is a strategy to try to minimize the infectivity of the virus. So this is out there, and this is why I'm betting on it.
That's really interesting. So talk to me about the comorbidities. I know that everybody's on diabetes is wildly problematic, and if you have underlying diabetes, you are in real trouble if you get COVID-19. But I was talking to another researcher, and they said that nothing had been officially done around obesity. Have they since then? That was a few weeks ago.
It's a good question. In the data that I've looked at, they have talked about obesity as a risk factor, but I can't say with confidence that I've actually reviewed the obesity substrata of patients and whether that was not confounded by other factors. But you're right, diabetes, specifically unmanaged diabetes, where you have A1Cs that are really high, that's where the risk is highest. All these conditions are conditions that essentially plague America. Obesity, diabetes, the ones we haven't talked about, coronary artery disease, lung disease, asthma. I mean, these are all problems that many Americans have and carry with them. I think there are a couple of things to notice here. One is it's about function, right? So if you have, let's say, this is how I explain it to my son. If you have function that's like this, and you take a hit, you're down to here. But maybe that's fine. Maybe you can kind of go on with your day. You don't even notice it. But if your function was already like this, and then you go down this, you feel that. You'll be short of breath, you'll be really tired, and you'll be admitted to the hospital. That's one factor. The other factor is the fact that not only are you just losing function, but maybe you're actually hitting the same target. So we know with cardiovascular disease, what's damaged there? The intimal lining of the blood vessels. That's fancy talk for the inner lining of that vessel wall. That's what's damaged.
Dude, that's really interesting. I want to stop you there to make sure that I understand this, because now pieces just click together from where you started. So originally what I was hearing was part of the reason that diabetes was creating such a problem is you've got high HA1C levels, the hemoglobin is getting all clumped up with the sugar in the bloodstream, is making oxygen transport very difficult. So you've got a disease that's already exacerbating or lowering your ability to get the oxygen, coupled with another comorbidity that does the same thing. And now you have this double whammy and you've got a real problem, which explains why intubating people with the ventilators isn't working. It's not a mechanical problem. This is in the bloodstream. You're just not able to shuttle the oxygen properly. When I think about heart disease, and again, I could not be more of a novice, but when I think about heart disease and the way that it attacks the lining, and I think what a lot of people misunderstand, and correct me if I'm explaining this improperly, is that when you get plaque buildup, it's not like it's clumping together inside the normal transit part of the blood vessel. It's actually in the lining of the blood vessel. And so it creates like this bulge. And so if that's a like inflammation issue with the epithelial lining, if I'm not mistaken, and this is further inflaming that area, then this makes sense as to why this would exacerbate the problem. And just from the little bit that I know about the sort of physiological impact of obesity, fat is a signaling organ, which is crazy to think about, but that is pro-inflammatory. So if you have all these crazy inflammatory markers, and then that leads into the cytokine storm, it's sort of all starting to make sense.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You're right in describing it. It's causing a bulge, and so in some cases, obviously, you'd have some breakage there in that lining or the covering of that bulge. But the fact is, you're right. It's in the walls, and it causes that thing to bulge out. And when it bulges out, if you damage the thing that's lining it, then yeah, now you've got all this fatty, gooey mess that's going to cause lots of inflammation and can cause heart attacks and strokes and things like that, because that starts to break apart and create essentially a blood clot right there. That's how strokes happen. Now, and heart attacks. Now, with COVID-19, you talked about the phrase cytokine storm, and it's out there. People talk about it. There is a lot of increasing evidence that that's exactly right. And specifically, there's one called IL-6.
Can you describe for people exactly what a cytokine is? It's because once I understood what it does, I was like, okay, I get why this is a problem.
Yeah, totally. Let's say that I'm in a room full of other people, and I'm a cell, and I've got to communicate things to the people around me. Well, I can't just like speak. Cells don't have voices. They don't have the ability to just talk through words. So they talk through molecules, and these molecules, they're not words. They're cytokines. And so cytokines and which cytokines you put together and the number of cytokines all tell a story. So if I'm screaming, in other words, if I'm letting out a lot of IL-6, I'm telling a story to all the cells around me that, like, hey, I'm dying, I'm going down here, and things aren't going well for me. Are they going well for you? And if all the cells are screaming and they're all letting out IL-6, well, now you can detect that in the blood. And you can check someone's IL-6 level. You're like, oh my gosh, this is high. The cells are screaming. They're in danger, and this isn't going well. And so that's what a cytokine is. It's basically a way of one cell talking to its neighbors. It's words, and we can detect them. And we can put together a story based on what we think IL-6 means in the context of the other words. And that one I'm talking about a lot because we know that, for example, kids are doing better than the elderly with COVID-19. And if you look at their cytokine profiles, you see why. They have lower levels of a lot of these cytokines, specifically IL-6, but also some other ones that may tell you that actually kids with ARDS are doing better because of these profiles looking better. And maybe that cytokine storm is a warning from the cells that, hey, the ship is going down here.
Correct me if this is inaccurate. So to sort of use your analogy of the screaming, that the cytokines are basically screaming, saying, or the words that they represent are, dear immune system, come and address this, attack this thing. I'm going down. You need to get this thing. And so the reason that the cytokine storm becomes a problem is you have every cell screaming out, immune system, come and like attack this motherfucker. And so now the immune system is going bananas, and you actually get the immune system just attacking everything because it's on such high alert. It's like shooting first and asking questions later. And so the body has essentially, it's got this military that's now shooting everything in its sight. And diving into sort of at a cellular level, what's happening, if your body is already, you have diabetes, you are obese, you already have all this inflammation, you already have cytokines saying, yo, we have a problem. And now you throw this other thing in, if you have a high viral load, and just literally every cell is crying out that it has a problem, you get how the immune system becomes trigger happy and just goes bananas.
Exactly. And by the way, the immune system is also part of the problem, right? It's releasing some IL-6 too. But what the immune system tries to do is say, like, hey, we need to make the blood vessels here a little leaky so that our immune cells can get in and deal with whatever the problem is.
Whoa, I've never heard that before. What do you mean, leaky?
So when a blood vessel is passing by an airway, normally it's not leaky, meaning liquid can't get out of that blood vessel. So it's nice and tight between cells lining that wall. Well, when you have inflammation, just think of when you've fallen and banged your knee, you have inflammation there. Well, it gets puffy, right? And immediately it kind of swells up. What is swelling exactly? Well, it's leakage of liquid out of the blood vessels and into the tissues.
Whoa.
So endothelial cells, instead of being nice and tight like I'm showing you right here, they become more like that.
Whoa.
And as a result, stuff is getting through. Well, some of the stuff is good, right? It's immune cells getting through. That's great. Good job. Good on you for sending out the immune cells. But it's also fluid. And so that's what happens when you bang your knee or bang anything. It's kind of swollen and puffy. That's fluid getting through, right? So your blood has things other than blood cells and white blood cells. It also has serum, right? So the serum component has a lot of proteins. So that's antibodies. That's a big part of it. And those antibodies are going to be necessary to be part of this immune response. So you want these proteins to get over there. You also have albumin and other proteins too. So they're getting across. Albumin doesn't get across, but the other proteins do. And the reason that this is important is that if you now have leakiness, not just in one area, but in all areas, because you're screaming all over the body and your immune system's kind of like going bang, bang, bang. All right, we have to respond everywhere. Well, what happens when you get kind of diffuse leakiness? Well, now you've got a lot of wetness. You've got a lot of extra fluid that's sitting between the airspace over here and the blood vessel. Before, the blood vessel and the airspace were nice and tight. Now you're filling up with fluid because, again, they're leaky, right? The fluid's got to go somewhere. It's going in between. And now you're asking oxygen to get all the way from here to here, and it's got a lake to swim through now that it never used to have to swim through, right? What do you think that happens? A lot less oxygen gets across. And so you become hypoxic. And so that hypoxemia that we're talking about, with this and the shortness of breath, you get all that stuff. That's in part due to this massive lake you've created. And you're creating it not just in one part of the lungs, it's all over. And so you've got all this fluid now that's preventing oxygen from getting to where it needs to go, which is the blood vessels. And that's a big part of what happens with SIRS, or when you get a systemic inflammatory response syndrome. And that's what happens. ARDS and diffuse inflammation causes fluid to get everywhere. In fact, it also gets in your tissues. So a lot of these patients end up being super puffy because they've just got fluid everywhere. There's fluid onboarded, and their kidneys can't push it out because oftentimes their kidneys are failing. So you end up getting into a very positive fluid balance as a result. And that's what happens not just in this disease, but but in a lot of diseases where the end state is this massive inflammatory state. Does that make sense?
Oh my God, very much so. Really being able to grasp what's going on is super powerful. And I guess I'm talking to the audience. Like, this stuff begins to stack. Like, since I started doing health theory, it's like, one person will say one thing and you kind of hold on to it, but you don't really understand like where that goes. And then another person says something, and you just begin to like put all of this stuff together to, I guess, get a deeper understanding of why it's so important to take care of your health. And when I can imagine something, when I can picture the state of my blood vessels, like, it actually gives me more motivation to do things that I don't necessarily want to do. I want to eat ice cream and play video games all day. That's what I want to do. But, I work out and I eat right and all that stuff. And it really, really helps, like, to actually piece these things together. Speaking of the pieces that are coming together, you mentioned serum. And I want to talk about passive immunity, what we're finding with blood plasma, like, what's the state of that?
Yeah, great question. And thanks for breaking it down like that for your audience. I feel the same way, that when I understand something, I care about it. If I don't understand it, I don't care. And if I care about it, I'm much more inclined to do something about it, because caring equals motivation. As far as serum goes in plasma, let's be really clear. We've done this many times before. This is not new. In fact, for many viruses, let's take a very classic virus, measles. You can go in, if you're a high-risk patient, and if you're in the setting of an outbreak of measles, you would be given measles antibody. That's a thing. In fact, if you have other conditions, you might have heard of the phrase IVIG. What is that? That's intravenous, in the vein, Ig, immunoglobulin. So this is extremely common. And the new thing is we're trying it with COVID-19, because we're saying, hey, we've tried it with all these other diseases. Maybe it works here too. Of course it works. It makes sense. It's logical. What it is let's say between you and I, let's say that I get COVID-19 and I do fairly well and I recover. And in the weeks afterwards, you check my blood, and of course, as you would predict, I get an immune response, and I have antibody floating around. I have a lot of it. So you basically take that antibody and you purify it. And then let's say you get COVID-19 and unfortunately you don't do so well for whatever reason. You end up in the hospital and you go to the ICU and you're sick and you're on other medications. You're on antivirals and you're on steroids, and they're like, yeah, we don't know how he's going to do. We really hope for the best, but who knows? In that situation, they would give you my antibody. As long as other things are cleaned up about it and you wouldn't have a reaction, they would give it to you. And what we've seen is that generally speaking, when it's done, it works. It seems to make people better. Now here's the catch. I purposely mentioned you're on steroids and you're on antivirals. Well, what made you better? Was it the passive immunity? Was it the other stuff you're on? Was it the fact that time passed, your immune system kicked in? Who knows? And the question is not does it work, but how much does this work? Is this moving the needle a lot? Or is it like, yeah, it's good, but that's not really what made him better. So that's what we're trying to figure out, is how much of a benefit you really get from this. And in the coming days and weeks, of course, we're going to start seeing plasma drives where, you say, hey, if you've recovered, go donate blood, but also donate plasma to help those that are sicker than you. This is a national effort. This is going to happen. And so it's just a matter of kind of figuring out what levels we accept, what levels we think are safe, et cetera, et cetera.
Let me ask the obvious question. How on earth would that not be 100% effective?
Yeah, great question. So the first thing is that I'm giving you antibody, but antibodies are proteins and proteins break down. So it's a little bit like I'm giving you fish. I didn't give you a fisherman. So I didn't teach your cells how to make the antibody. Only a vaccine can do that. I just gave you the fish. And that will turn over time. It'll degrade. In fact, in some cases, a quick example of this is that many cases where you do need IVIG infusions, what's the frequency of those infusions? Monthly. So you might need a monthly infusion of IVIG. Well, why? Because it breaks down. And so the question is, how do you respond with your immune system? Well, a crash course in immunology, here it goes, is you have your innate immunity. We talked a little bit about that, mucus, you've got some cells, that's all part of your innate immunity. And then you've got your adaptive immunity, which is really characterized by kind of two big categories of cells. There's a third, but mostly it's your B cells and your T cells. Those two categories of cells are doing different things and they work together. And so you want to be able to, for example, track down infected cells and destroy them. Does antibodies do that? It helps, but that's not the actual cell destroying the other cell. So there are other parts of your immune system that you need to fight this effectively. An antibody helps a little bit, it's like bringing the violins to the game, but you still need the whole orchestra to make this sound right. And that's just a part of it, not all of it. So yeah, it helps. It doesn't cure the infection completely.
I actually have a question. I can't believe I've never asked anybody this. Why are vaccines so hard to create? Like if this is one of the main strands of this virus, slap it around or whatever people do to weaken it and inject it. And obviously there's a reason that it's hard. So I'm not saying that like I've solved something. I'm just curious, what is it that makes it hard?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say it's hard, it's just time consuming. So there's preclinical trials, that's where you weaken the virus or do whatever you're going to do to kind of figure this out. That happens and happened on a course of a few weeks for COVID-19. So vaccine manufacturers got their act together. They worked hard on this because everyone obviously sees the need. And over the matter of weeks, let's say 6 to 8 weeks for some of them, they got the vaccine ready for phase 1. Amazing. That's pretty fast. Phase 1 is a safety study. Is it safe? Okay, that makes sense. That happens over a few weeks. Phase 2 is immunogenicity. So if I give you the vaccine, why don't I measure some stuff to see did you mount an immune response? I can maybe measure your antibody levels. Maybe I can look and see if your T cells are responding. I can do these things to see if there was any sort of effect. Those things all happen relatively quickly. Now here's the kicker, phase 3. Phase 3 of these trials is where it takes forever. And I'll tell you why. Basically what you're doing at that point is you're saying, all right, it's safe, there's some sort of immune response. Does it work in a clinical trial setting? And the key here is it's called vaccine efficacy, not effectiveness, efficacy. So vaccine efficacy is in a controlled environment. If I vaccinate a bunch of people and then I follow another group of people that didn't get vaccinated, does the group that got vaccinated have a lower rate of disease? Well, how are you going to know that? Well, you're going to know if they catch the disease at a lower rate. Well, if we're all isolating, we're all kind of trying to keep ourselves protected and cocooned, you're not going to really see a difference in these two groups, right? It's going to take a while to see a difference. And so these trials can last like 12 months, 18 months to really see a difference in efficacy between these two populations, right? That's statistically significant. And it's a large group of people you got to get to even do it to notice that tiny difference, right? So that's the phase 3 trial. It takes forever. Phase 4 is vaccine effectiveness. Now you launch it in your country or your kingdom or whatever it is that you have, and you say, in real life, are we seeing that? And what if in real life, people can't get the vaccine because it's only given in one city and the people in the rural areas are like, I couldn't get vaccinated. I didn't get it. I didn't decide to do it. Or you have people saying, I don't want to get vaccinated. I don't trust it. It might have something in it that's dangerous. Or you have people that say, I can't give the vaccine here at my clinic. We don't have a fridge. And you told me it has to be within this certain temperature. And we just have power outs. So, the vaccine went bad. All sorts of logistical and practical and social issues that prevent you from getting the same effects that you got in the vaccine efficacy trial, where literally your population is not benefiting at all, maybe, even though technically they could have. That's the effectiveness of these. Now, here's the kicker. Have you heard of human challenge studies, or is this something you're familiar with?
I have, because I cheated, and I've obviously done a lot of research for this episode. But please tell people what it is.
Yeah, basically, it's giving a person the virus. And on the face of that, sounds super unethical. Oh my gosh, you're giving people the virus? This thing that we're all told to wash our hands and wash our apples over, and now you're giving it to people? How could that be okay? And I'm not here suggesting that it is okay. All I'm going to tell you is that this is a thing. The WHO has a whole written piece about it. They do that. It has been done. And the idea is that there are ways to mitigate the risk. You take low-risk individuals that otherwise had a good chance of getting the natural virus, from their community, and then you make sure they get the best monitoring and the best care. And that's your way of essentially saying, all right, this is our way of minimizing the harm. And if you can get a handful of people that you can literally just, let's say you spray them in the face like a cologne bottle with the virus, let it get into their eyes, nose, and mouth, you can figure out what dose they need to even get sick. So now we finally know the viral dose or inoculum you need, which right now we're sort of conjecturing about, but then you would know. And then you could say, okay, well, given that dose, the people that got vaccinated actually did quite well. And the people that didn't. And so we think that this was very protective, and you can do it in a small cohort of people because you're actually giving the virus rather than just like sitting back and waiting for things to naturally happen. And that condenses the timeline. And that's what the whole ethical argument is about, is a week saved on the vaccine trial, presuming that it's a successful one, you get the vaccine out to people, is that justifiably okay for then turning around and doing something like giving people the real virus? Is that trade-off acceptable? And people can debate that and should debate that, but that's what human challenge studies are.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about vitamin D. How important is it? If I'm not mistaken, there's actually levels certainly that are too low to provide any real benefit, but there's also levels that are too high, which I had never heard that before.
Yeah, it's a good question. So there is, like most things, the more you dig, the more the controversy there is. Vitamin D is no different. So there is some controversy around it. What I'll say is that the Endocrine Society put out levels that I personally think make the most sense. They suggested something like 75 nanomoles per liter as a target. That 75 nanomoles per liter target, in my personal opinion, might even be a little higher. It might be okay, maybe 100 or so. So when you get up to those levels, what they've said in the endocrine papers at least is that it really promotes bone health. It promotes protection against viruses as one thing, and infections in general. So a number of kind of categories of disease. But among them was, as you just had me say, respiratory viruses. And so another study said, hey, if you give people vitamin D, do they get less respiratory virus illnesses? And the answer was emphatically yes. And in fact, that was mostly in people that were very vitamin D deficient. So they said if you were less than 25 nanomoles per liter, which is pretty low, and then you got a daily dose, in that study they said, about 5,000 per week, then you stand to benefit the most in terms of having a reduction in the number of respiratory illnesses you got. That was a recommendation. The Endocrine Society said, well, let's zoom out, not just to respiratory infections, but let's look at bone health and these other kind of factors, and say maybe the target should be your target level. The other one didn't have a target level, but your target level may ought to be around 75. And to get there, you might need 2,000 units per day if you're an adult. So that was their recommendation. The only reason I'm suggesting that maybe even a little bit higher might be okay is there were studies done looking at folks like lifeguards in the Midwest and folks living in Hawaii and East African tribes that essentially are out in the sun more. And in those groups, those three different groups, the levels were much higher, above 100. And so the question is, perhaps a normal level for a human being is above 100, and not sure how much higher, but let's say 100 at least. And perhaps the reason all of us are essentially much lower, or many of us, is because we're indoors, we're wearing a lot of clothes, we're hunkered behind our laptops like you and I are right now, and this is our kind of new lifestyle, right? Like even when we go out to work out, many of us go to the gym, which is covered, and you're not really getting the sunlight that human beings were essentially evolved to develop and kind of live with. And so we're all essentially pretty deficient. And that maybe in the absence of that, we do need supplements to get us back to a normal, healthy level to boost our immune health, among other things. And from the reading I've done, it definitely seems beneficial to get more sunlight for most of us. And there are certain groups that are at high risk. So, for example, if you're darker skinned tone, like, I'm darker than you, for example, if I'm out there and you're out there, you're benefiting more than I am. And so I'm at higher risk of developing deficiencies. And we see this in terms of like latitude bands as well. So probably in certain groups, there should be monitoring or routine surveillance of vitamin D levels. The other thing is testing itself is not great. So sometimes you can take the same sample of blood, test it 5 different ways, and maybe get kind of scattershot results. And so that is a separate problem of testing reliability. But on the vitamin D point, I think generally what most people agree on is there is value to getting more sunlight from the sun. There is more value. I mean, also psychological benefits as well, which we didn't even talk about. But there's also value of probably taking supplements if you're not able to do that, and most people are probably deficient.
Yeah, vitamin D is implicated in a lot of things. That definitely seems like one that people should really be going out of their way. It's my understanding, though, that if you're over, whether you're supplementing or getting into the sun, it's my understanding that at some point your body begins to break it down. I didn't think your body would let you go, quote unquote, too high. Is that not true?
So the societies have put out thresholds, and they say, you should probably be careful of vitamin D toxicity above a certain level. But like most things, if we can chemically reduce it to a pill, and if you, let's say, take 50 of those pills on a day, probably you can overdose on vitamin D in a way that could potentially hurt you. There's probably clear evidence of that. Having said that, I think that the pendulum clearly is swung in the area of deficiency, not overdoses at the moment. And so I think that doing it in a smart and kind of stable way over time makes a lot of sense. and that we probably should be advocating for more vitamin D for people in general.
Yeah, for sure. Rishi, where can people connect with you, man? You're putting out so much rad information. What is the best place to connect?
Well, thank you. I love the word rad, so it's nice to hear it. I will say that we're basically putting out COVID-19 content on osmosis.org/COVID-19. So that's all free. We even have CME courses for those of your audience members that need CME. It's a free course, so go check it out.
Continuing medical education?
Yeah, exactly. So that's the acronym there. And it's, it's aimed at health professionals, but honestly, I think it's just aimed at anybody that's motivated and interested can follow it. And so, yeah, go check out that site again, osmosis.org/COVID-19 to get, the latest information as we know it.
Amazing. Well, dude, thank you so much. One last question. If you were going to have people make a single change that you think will have the biggest impact on their health and preventing getting COVID-19, what change would you have them make?
I just did a video today about climate change, and it's about climate change and COVID-19. And I do think that we're very focused on COVID-19, rightly so. I think that when you're thinking about things that feel like future threats, like climate change, that feels a little bit amorphous. As a human brain goes, I think we have a harder time wrapping ourselves around that. And for climate change and for health and for a number of other reasons, I personally would recommend going out and eating some vegetables today. And I can't think of anything that's more important than the fiber you get, the nutrients you get, the sense of fulfillment from healthy proteins you get from eating vegetables. So that's what I would recommend.
My man. All right. Well, thank you so much, man. And again, guys, the content that he's putting out truly is rad. You will enjoy it. He is putting out a lot. There is a ton of content. Osmosis is putting out a lot of free stuff that's really amazing. Highly encourage you guys to check it out if you haven't already. And speaking of things that if you haven't done, you should do. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care.
Hey everyone, I want to tell you all about our sponsor, Whoop. Life can be stressful. We're all impacted by stress differently though. From what we do at work, how we train, and our lives at home, we're constantly exerting ourselves. And oftentimes, we only think about what we do to stay fit and how we eat, but we overlook the importance of sleep in all of this. Tomorrow's best work though is done by night. And our sponsor, Whoop, is a fitness tracker strap with an incredible app that helps monitor your sleep. Whoop provides the personalized insights to make smarter performance habits from your sleep. Whoop tracks all things sleep, from your sleep cycles, stages, disturbances, and efficiency. Based on how strenuous your day is, Whoop will provide suggested sleep times so your body is able to get the rest it needs to recover. Whoop also automatically tracks workouts so you can focus on your training. Whoop has a built-in app that's amazing, and it has this cool feature that allows you to track your strain from training in real time, monitor your calories burned, heart rate, and what zone your heart is in. The Whoop Strap 3.0 has 5-day battery life and on-the-go charging, so you never need to take it off, and it's even waterproof. You can also sync your heart rate to compatible treadmills, bikes, and rowers. And the Whoop membership service provides a fitness tracker for free and gives members access to their app, which provides personalized insight into recovery, strain, and sleep. If you're looking to be smarter about how you sleep, recover, and train so you can be at your best, you have to get Whoop. Whoop is offering 15% off to our audience when you go to whoop.com and use the code HT at checkout. That's WHOOP.com and use the code HT at checkout to save 15% off your order. Unlock your best self today with Whoop. All right, guys, take care and be legendary.
Thank you guys so much for watching and being a part of this community. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. You're going to get weekly videos on building a growth mindset, cultivating grit, and unlocking your full potential.